Amelia Langford walked into the old hangar with the smile of a woman used to buying the world. In front of her lawyers, she dropped a lowball contract onto the workbench, pressuring Mason Carter to sell the hangar his father left behind for the price of scrap metal. She assumed he was nothing more than a poor single father patching airplanes to survive. But when her airline froze solid, its accounts locked, its entire fleet grounded on a long, silent runway, Mason finally rose. And this time, he did not sell the hangar. He bought her entire empire outright instead. Stay with this story until the end, because one final signature will completely reverse every last ounce of power seen. The story began at a small private airfield outside a quiet Texas town, on a morning when the wind refused to settle and dust rolled lazily across the cracked runway. Mason Carter's hangar stood at the edge of the field, its metal walls faded to the color of old nickel, its sliding doors streaked with rust that had bled down in thin brown lines over the decades. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal shavings, and a small single-engine plane sat with one panel removed, wires and hydraulic lines exposed like the ribs of something patient and half asleep. Mason worked calmly at a bench nearby, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands stained dark with grease, his attention fixed on a fuel injector he was testing for a client who trusted no one else with the job. He did not hear the convoy of black sedans until the gravel crunched under their tires. Amelia Langford stepped out first, dressed in a tailored coat that had never once brushed against a workbench, followed by Lucas Bennett and 3 junior attorneys carrying leather folders. She did not offer a greeting. She walked the perimeter of the hangar the way a woman might walk through a house she already intended to gut, glancing at the rust, the dents, the stack of tires, leaning against the far wall, cataloging it all as evidence of a place already dying. She told him plainly that Madison Air wanted to acquire the hangar to expand its emergency maintenance operations. Lucas stepped forward and placed a contract on the workbench, the numbers on the page laughably small, a fraction of what the land and structure were worth even in their current condition. Mason wiped his hands on a rag and read the terms without expression, noticing quickly the clause that gave him exactly 7 days to vacate before the offer would be considered accepted by default. Amelia, watching the mechanics gathered nearby, remarked loud enough for them to hear that a man like him should feel grateful someone as important as her was willing to buy something so close to becoming scrap. Mason did not raise his voice. He asked quite simply whether she had checked the legal history attached to this particular strip of land before sending her lawyers out here with a contract this small. Amelia laughed coldly, certain he was stalling to squeeze a better number out of her. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he was a single father, implying he owed it to his daughter to take whatever was offered rather than cling to pride he could not afford. Mason closed the folder and slid it back across the bench toward Lucas without another glance at the numbers inside. He told her the hangar was not for sale. Amelia's expression shifted, the practiced warmth draining out of it entirely, replaced by something colder and more direct. She warned him that if he refused, she had the resources to bury him in permits, banking pressure, and airfield politics until he had nothing left to refuse with. Mason only looked at her steadily and suggested that she might want to focus her attention on saving her own airline before she tried to take somebody else's hangar. For one brief second, something in her composure cracked, a flicker of uncertainty she quickly buried beneath irritation. Lucas, sensing the tension climbing past what was useful, took her elbow and guided her back toward the cars. Amelia glanced once more at the rusted doors and the quiet man standing in front of them, and silently promised herself that before this was finished, Mason Carter would be the one begging her to take the hangar off his hands. The scene shifted to the headquarters of Madison Air, a glass tower downtown that gleamed with the kind of polish meant to disguise exactly how much was falling apart inside it. Amelia walked into the boardroom trying to hold on to the composure she had worn so easily at the hangar that morning, though the air in this room felt heavier, thinner, harder to breathe. Evelyn Moore, the banker holding the majority of the airline's debt, sat at the far end of the table with a folder thick enough to make several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Evelyn explained, without softening any of it, that Madison Air had breached several covenants tied to its outstanding loans. Short-term debt was coming due, revenue had slipped for 3 consecutive quarters, maintenance costs had climbed sharply, and a handful of aircraft had already been grounded due to incomplete safety documentation. Joseph Grant, the operations director, jumped in quickly to blame fuel prices and a difficult market, deflecting attention away from anything resembling his own department's failures. Amelia trusted him almost by instinct, since he had once been her mother's closest and most loyal deputy, a man who had been present since the earliest days of the company. Evelyn warned that if Madison Air could not present new collateral within 10 days, the bank would freeze its remaining credit lines entirely. Lucas suggested quietly that acquiring the hangar from Mason at a steep discount could be folded into their asset portfolio, inflating their numbers just enough to satisfy the bank's demands before the deadline. Amelia, still stinging from her earlier rejection, seized on the idea with more determination than logic, unaware that the hangar carried a history stretching back to a time when her mother had been the one signing agreements on that very property. Jackson Reed, a former chief pilot who had overheard part of the meeting from the hallway, felt a knot form in his stomach the moment Mason's name was mentioned in connection with the acquisition plan. After the meeting ended, he pulled Amelia aside and told her plainly that provoking a fight with Mason Carter was not something she wanted to do. When she asked why a poor mechanic running a rundown hangar should frighten anyone, Jackson simply told her that Mason had quietly saved more flight crews over the years than she could possibly imagine. Amelia dismissed it as sentimental nonsense, certain that people were exaggerating the legend of a man who had clearly failed at everything that mattered in business. Joseph, who had been listening from a few steps away, understood immediately that Mason represented a serious threat to secrets he had spent years burying. He made a call that afternoon to a contact at the Regional Airfield Authority, quietly setting in motion an effort to have Mason's permits, tax filings, fire code compliance, and land lease agreement all reviewed at once. Meanwhile, back at the hangar, Mason worked without any apparent worry, moving through his afternoon as though he had already anticipated every move being made against him from across town. He opened a small floor safe tucked beneath a workbench, revealing old technical files, a patent registration, mortgage papers, and a folder bearing the printed name of Madison Air across its faded cover. He studied a signature at the bottom of one document for a long moment, recognizing the careful, deliberate handwriting of a woman who had once trusted him more than her own company's leadership ever would again. Mason set the folder down and stared out through the hangar's dusty window toward the runway in the distance, thinking of how differently things might have unfolded had that old agreement been honored the way it was written. He had spent years telling himself that the past no longer mattered, that the hangar and the work in front of him were enough, that reopening old wounds would only cost him more than he had left to lose. Yet here it was again, arriving uninvited, dragged back into the light by a woman who had no idea what she was standing on top of. He closed the safe slowly, locked it, and returned to the engine on his bench, letting the quiet hum of familiar work settle his thoughts the way it always had. The next morning brought a wave of officials to the hangar all at once, an airfield inspector, a representative from the local bank, and a legal aide carrying a clipboard thick with forms. They demanded to see his repair permits, his land lease agreement, his fire safety documentation, and every tax filing from the past several years. A few of the younger mechanics working under Mason grew visibly nervous, worried the entire hangar might be sealed shut before the day was over. Mason remained unhurried, pulling files from a cabinet one at a time, handing over exactly what was requested without hesitation or complaint. Lucas, however, had prepared something sharper than a simple inspection. He argued that a strip of land behind the hangar technically fell within a planned airfield expansion zone, and could therefore be subject to reclamation under a decades-old municipal agreement. Mason was ordered to suspend all commercial repair work for 3 full days while the claim was reviewed, a suspension that cost him an important maintenance contract he had been counting on to cover the following month's expenses. Amelia arrived just as the suspension notice was being posted, seemingly eager to witness the moment Mason's confidence finally cracked under pressure. She offered him a new contract, still far below fair value but slightly higher than before, framing it as his last real chance before things grew worse. Mason asked her directly whether she understood what she was actually trying to buy. Amelia answered coldly that she was purchasing land, not his pride, and she had no interest in either. Mason said nothing more, though the silence in the hangar afterward felt sharp enough that several of his workers glared at her retreating figure with open resentment on his behalf. Amelia walked back to her car with the satisfied posture of someone who believed she had already won. That evening, Jackson arrived quietly, parking away from the main gate so no one would notice his truck. He told Mason that Joseph had been running the maintenance department into the ground for years, padding invoices, approving counterfeit parts, and funneling extra payments through shell companies disguised as outside vendors. Mason was not surprised, admitting he had suspected something like this for a long time, based on patterns he had noticed in industry gossip and old supplier records. Jackson pleaded with him to help Amelia before it was too late, reminding him that the airline had once been Madison Langford's greatest achievement and deserved better than being destroyed by the greed of the men she had trusted. Mason refused to step in immediately, insisting that Amelia needed to see the truth herself before anyone handed her a rescue she had not earned. Jackson asked quietly whether Mason still carried anger toward the Langford family after everything that had happened years earlier. Mason only looked toward an old photograph of his father hanging near the workbench, offering no answer at all. Later that night, an email arrived from a private investment contact informing him that a large portion of Madison Air's secured debt was quietly being shopped around to potential buyers before the situation became public knowledge. Mason opened his laptop, studied the figures for a long moment, and began placing purchase orders through a holding company registered under a name no one at Madison Air would recognize. He worked late into the night, quietly acquiring pieces of debt at a fraction of face value from lenders eager to shed exposure before the airline's troubles became public knowledge. Each purchase order was routed through layers of paperwork designed to keep his own name entirely out of sight, a precaution he had learned to take years earlier when he first understood how quickly people treated a wealthy man differently than a poor one. He was not doing this out of greed or vanity, and he reminded himself of that fact more than once as the numbers on his screen grew larger. He was doing it because he understood, better than almost anyone else in that airline's boardroom, exactly how fragile a company could become once the wrong people were left holding the controls. By the time he finally closed the laptop and turned off the shop lights, the suspension notice taped to his hangar door felt almost irrelevant against what he had quietly set into motion. The story turned briefly to the past, unfolding through what Jackson had once witnessed himself years earlier. Long before either woman had taken the company's helm, Madison Langford used to send the airline's very first aircraft to this same hangar for repair, back when the whole operation consisted of little more than 2 planes and a handful of loyal employees. Mason's father had been a gifted mechanic, brilliant with his hands but never skilled at the business side of anything, content to let contracts and paperwork pile up while he focused entirely on keeping engines running. Mason, still young at the time, had designed an engine vibration analysis system capable of detecting mechanical failures long before they became dangerous, a piece of work far beyond what anyone expected from someone his age. Madison Langford recognized the value of what young Mason had built almost immediately, and she personally signed a partnership agreement with the Carter family granting them ongoing compensation tied to the technology's use across her growing fleet. After her death, however, Joseph and a newly installed leadership team quietly buried the agreement, erasing it from company memory as thoroughly as they could manage. Mason was pushed out without ceremony, his father lost the contract that had once kept the hangar financially stable, and the business slid slowly into the disrepair visible in its rusted doors today. Mason never filed a lawsuit at the time, too consumed with caring for his family and keeping the hangar from collapsing entirely to fight a battle he was not certain he could win. In the present, that same vibration analysis system remained exactly the kind of technology Madison Air desperately needed to prove its safety credentials to both the bank and federal regulators. The hangar itself was not merely a building either, since it still carried special maintenance rights, historic certification records, and direct runway access that Madison Langford herself had signed into permanent existence decades earlier. If Amelia managed to acquire it cheaply, she would unknowingly be seizing the very key capable of saving her company. If Mason kept it instead, he would hold real leverage in any negotiation with the bank that held her debt. Mason had no desire to destroy Amelia, yet he felt no obligation to rescue a woman who had just tried to crush him underfoot days earlier. A brief moment showed Mason glancing at his phone, noticing a missed call from his daughter Grace, though he chose not to answer it while sitting in the middle of an important call regarding the debt purchases. The details served only to remind the audience that he was a single father carrying real responsibilities at home, without pulling his daughter into the unfolding conflict at the airline in any direct way. Mason promised himself quietly that he would not allow sentiment to weaken his resolve the way it once had years earlier when trust in the wrong people had cost his family everything they had built. Meanwhile, Joseph, having learned that Mason still possessed old company files, ordered a search of Madison Air's own archive department, desperate to locate any surviving paperwork before it could resurface. He discovered, with mounting panic, that if the original agreement ever became public, he could face prosecution for years of intellectual property fraud and falsified maintenance records. The section closed with Joseph issuing quiet instructions to have the hangar sabotaged that very night, determined to destroy whatever evidence Mason still kept hidden inside it. Joseph told himself, as he made the arrangements, that this was simply a matter of protecting the company from a distraction it could not afford, though the truth was far more personal than that. He had built an entire career on the assumption that Madison Langford's early records would remain buried forever, and the sudden reappearance of Mason Carter threatened to unravel every careful lie he had told over the years to keep his position secure. He chose a contractor he had used before for smaller, quieter jobs, someone accustomed to working without questions and disappearing before sunrise. The instructions were simple enough: destroy the file cabinets, damage the electrical systems just enough to look accidental, and leave nothing behind that could be traced back to Madison Air's operations department. Joseph hung up the phone feeling, for the first time in years, that he had finally taken control of a situation that had begun slipping away from him the moment Mason's name resurfaced in that boardroom. Night settled over the airfield, the property quiet except for the low hum of a single work light inside Mason's hangar, where he stayed late finishing an engine repair for a longtime customer. A stranger slipped through a side door near the back fence, moving quickly toward the file cabinets with a small canister of accelerant tucked under one arm, intent on making the damage to the wiring look like an accidental electrical fault. Mason caught the smell of smoke almost immediately, cutting power at the main breaker before the flames could spread, smothering the small fire with a shop blanket before chasing the intruder out into the darkness beyond the fence line. The man escaped over the perimeter fence, but in his hurry he dropped a temporary contractor badge bearing a logo Mason recognized instantly as belonging to one of Madison Air's outside vendors. Mason understood immediately that Joseph had crossed a line no simple business dispute could explain away. At almost the same hour across town, one of Madison Air's aircraft triggered an engine warning during a scheduled test run ahead of an early morning departure. Joseph's technical team scrambled but could not identify the source of the fault quickly enough to feel confident clearing the aircraft for flight. Amelia was pulled out of bed with an urgent call and arrived at the airfield still half-dressed, unwilling to accept that her own operations department might be failing her at the worst possible moment. Jackson urged her repeatedly to call Mason, but Amelia resisted, unwilling to lower herself to ask help from a man she had humiliated only days earlier. As the tension in the hangar climbed and technicians grew increasingly desperate, Jackson made the decision himself, driving straight to Mason's hangar in the middle of the night to beg for his help before something worse happened. Mason's first instinct was cold reluctance, still raw from the sabotage attempt only hours earlier. But the moment Jackson mentioned that a flight crew's safety might be at risk, he grabbed his tools without another word of hesitation. He walked into Madison Air's maintenance bay only to be stopped immediately by Joseph, who mocked him openly in front of the assembled technicians, calling him an outsider with no business anywhere near a real airline's equipment. Amelia, watching the confrontation unfold, seemed almost as surprised by Mason's sudden appearance as Joseph was. Mason ignored the insults entirely, listening carefully to the engine's sound, studying vibration readouts on a nearby monitor, and within minutes identifying the fault as a substandard sensor that had clearly been swapped in place of the certified original part. Joseph attempted to deny it outright, insisting the part met every required specification. Mason demanded the test flight be grounded immediately, and Amelia, faced with the weight of the moment, overruled Joseph and ordered the cancellation herself. A deeper inspection minutes later confirmed exactly what Mason had claimed, proving that had the aircraft taken off as scheduled, the engine could very well have failed somewhere over open country with passengers and crew still aboard. Amelia looked at Mason for the first time without a trace of arrogance in her expression, something closer to genuine gratitude flickering briefly across her face. Mason left before she had the chance to say a word of thanks, walking back out into the cool night air with the faulty sensor sealed carefully in an evidence bag. The section closed with Mason mailing that same sensor the following morning to an independent testing laboratory, determined to have its failure documented beyond any possibility of dispute. He drove home that morning as the sun was just beginning to break over the flat horizon, exhaustion settling into his shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the hours he had lost sleeping. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely, to let Madison Air sink under the weight of its own corruption and simply protect what remained of his own small hangar. Yet another part of him, quieter but far more stubborn, refused to let good people, mechanics, pilots, and flight attendants who had nothing to do with Joseph's schemes, pay the price for decisions made far above their heads. He thought again of the missed call from Grace still sitting unanswered on his phone, and promised himself he would call her back the moment this particular fire, both literal and otherwise, had been fully put out. The laboratory report on the faulty sensor leaked far sooner than anyone at Madison Air had anticipated. Within days, news outlets were reporting that the airline had potentially used substandard components across its maintenance program, a story that spread quickly enough to spook investors and regulators alike. The bank froze what remained of Madison Air's available credit almost immediately, and Evelyn Moore informed the board that the company would now be forced into a mandatory restructuring process under close financial supervision. The boardroom fell into open panic, with several investors quietly discussing whether Amelia should be removed from her position entirely before the situation grew any worse. Amelia confronted Joseph directly, demanding an explanation for the failed part, but he deflected blame onto smaller outside suppliers and dared to suggest that Mason himself might have engineered the entire crisis purely out of revenge. Amelia, still not fully aware of the history between Mason and her mother's company, found herself genuinely torn over who to trust. Lucas advised her to file suit against Mason immediately, arguing that an aggressive legal offense was the best possible defense in a moment this precarious. Amelia called a press conference instead, standing before cameras and promising that Madison Air would defend its reputation to the very end, no matter what it cost. A reporter in the crowd asked pointedly how a small independent mechanic had managed to catch a dangerous defect that the airline's own extensive technical staff had somehow missed entirely. Amelia had no answer prepared, and the silence that followed said more than any statement could have. Meanwhile, Mason continued quietly acquiring discounted portions of Madison Air's outstanding debt through the investment company under his control, moving carefully and without any public announcement of what he was doing. He was not buying purely to profit from the situation, understanding instead that if Joseph remained in charge, the airline would eventually collapse entirely, taking hundreds of ordinary jobs down with it. Evelyn's team eventually discovered that the mysterious buyer accumulating so much of the company's debt had a spotless financial history, with funding traced back to aviation technology licensing and a series of quiet private transactions stretching back years. She began to suspect that Mason Carter was not nearly as poor as everyone at Madison Air had assumed him to be. Late one evening, Amelia arrived at the hangar without her lawyers this time, wanting to understand for herself exactly how a mechanic had come to know so much about her family's company. Mason showed her a portion of an old document bearing her mother's signature, and Amelia stared at it in visible shock, recognizing the handwriting immediately despite the years that had passed. Mason told her, without cruelty but without softening it either, that her mother had respected the people who kept airplanes safe, while Amelia herself had only ever known how to purchase people cheaply and discard them just as quickly. Amelia's anger flared, though she found she had no real argument to offer in response, the truth sitting too plainly in front of her to deny. The section closed with a call from Evelyn informing Amelia that a new creditor had quietly gained enough leverage to decide the entire future of Madison Air, whether she liked it or not. Amelia sat alone in her office for a long while after that call ended, the city lights spreading out beneath the window in a view she had once found comforting and now found strangely hollow. She thought back to the woman who had raised her, remembering fragments of advice about loyalty and character that she had absorbed as a child without ever fully understanding their weight. Somewhere along the way, she realized she had convinced herself that strength meant never bending, that softness was a weakness reserved for people who could not afford power. Watching Joseph's excuses fall apart in real time, and remembering the look on Mason's face when he showed her that old signature, she began to wonder whether she had built her entire identity on a foundation that was never as solid as she believed. For the first time since taking over the company, she felt something closer to fear than anger, a quiet dread that she had misjudged nearly everyone around her, including herself. The creditor meeting took place inside a large conference room at the bank's downtown offices, the kind of space designed to intimidate anyone unfamiliar with its polished glass and heavy silence. Amelia walked in with Lucas at her side, still holding on to the belief that some form of negotiation with the bank remained possible. Evelyn opened the meeting by announcing that Madison Air had exactly 48 hours to present a viable rescue plan or face immediate liquidation proceedings. Joseph proposed selling off assets, cutting the workforce sharply, and pressuring Mason into finally surrendering his hangar through whatever legal means remained available. Amelia sat quietly through the proposal, beginning to notice for the first time how much of Joseph's plan seemed designed purely to protect himself rather than the company or its employees. The door opened and Mason walked in accompanied by his own attorney, an entrance that stunned nearly everyone in the room, since no one had expected a small hangar mechanic to be invited anywhere near a creditor meeting of this magnitude. Evelyn introduced him formally as the representative of Carter Aviation Holdings, the entity that had quietly acquired the majority of Madison Air's secured debt over recent weeks. Amelia felt the floor shift beneath her, the reality of the situation finally settling in completely. Lucas attempted to object, but the paperwork Mason presented was entirely legitimate, verified and notarized well beyond any challenge his legal team could realistically mount. Mason spoke calmly, explaining that he had no interest in liquidating Madison Air, though he insisted on several conditions before any rescue plan could move forward, chief among them the immediate removal of Joseph and full transparency across every maintenance record the airline held. Joseph erupted, calling Mason an opportunist who had engineered this entire crisis purely to seize control of a company he had no right to touch. Mason responded by presenting the independent laboratory results on the faulty sensor, a series of falsified invoices, and a documented trail of payments flowing directly into a shell company secretly controlled by Joseph himself. Evelyn immediately ordered an internal investigation to begin without delay. Amelia looked at Joseph, truly understanding for the first time that she had spent years to defend the wrong man. Mason added one further condition, insisting that the hangar itself would remain his property, though he offered to transform it into an independent technical center should Madison Air agree to restructure honestly and completely. Amelia felt a wave of humiliation at the realization that the very man she had once tried to force into selling his hangar for pennies now held the power to determine her company's entire future. Mason showed no satisfaction in the moment, offering instead a simple observation that the airline did not need an arrogant billionaire at its helm, but rather a leader willing to listen honestly to uncomfortable truths. The section closed with Amelia signing an order suspending Joseph in front of the entire assembled board, the pen trembling slightly in her hand as she realized just how far her circumstances had shifted in only a matter of weeks. Joseph was escorted from the building by security shortly afterward, still shouting protests that no one in the room seemed particularly inclined to acknowledge any longer. Lucas gathered his papers quietly, avoiding eye contact with Amelia, already sensing that his own position within the company might not survive the fallout that was certain to follow this meeting. Evelyn remained behind after most of the board had filed out, speaking privately with Mason about the timeline required to formalize the restructuring plan and satisfy the bank's remaining conditions. Mason answered every question directly, laying out a schedule for reviewing the fleet's maintenance records, replacing compromised parts, and reassigning technical oversight to staff with verified histories of integrity. Amelia lingered near the window, watching the two of them speak, feeling strangely outside her own company for the first time since she had taken it over. She thought about calling her mother's old assistant, someone who might still remember the details of an agreement she was only now beginning to understand the true weight of. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Amelia felt genuinely uncertain about what kind of leader or person she wanted to become moving forward. Amelia drove to Madison Air's old archive facility the following week, determined to sort through her mother's original papers herself, rather than relying on second-hand summaries from staff she no longer fully trusted. Buried among boxes that had clearly not been opened in years, she found several files Joseph had deliberately hidden, including a handwritten letter her mother had once sent directly to Mason's father decades earlier. The letter described, in careful and grateful language, how young Mason's early technology had helped the airline avoid what could have been a catastrophic engine failure long before Amelia had even been born. Madison Langford had wanted to bring Mason onto the company's technical advisory board at the time, recognizing a rare talent she believed deserved far more recognition than he was receiving. After her sudden death, however, that plan had simply vanished along with so many of her other intentions, buried under new leadership more interested in short-term profit than long-term integrity. Amelia sat on the floor of that archive room for a long while, understanding for the first time that she had insulted a man who had once helped protect the very legacy she claimed to care about so deeply. She drove to the hangar early the next morning, arriving without any lawyers, without security, without the polished car she usually preferred for public appearances. Mason was working on a stuck wing flap when she walked in, and he did not stop what he was doing right away when she began to speak. Amelia apologized, her voice quieter and less certain than it had been during any of their previous encounters. Mason did not accept it easily, telling her plainly that an apology did not erase the years she had spent using money to crush people who had less power than she did. Amelia admitted that she had grown up terrified of losing the airline her mother built, and that fear had slowly hardened her into someone cold enough to believe cruelty was simply the price of staying in control. Mason offered no comfort in response, only pointing out that fear was never a valid excuse for humiliating people who had done nothing to deserve it. She asked whether he intended to dismantle the company entirely and sell off its aircraft piece by piece now that he held so much leverage over its future. Mason admitted he certainly could do exactly that, and that doing so would likely earn him a significant profit. But he told her he had no interest in punishing innocent mechanics, pilots, and flight attendants for crimes that belonged entirely to Joseph. Amelia, hearing this, began to understand for the first time that Mason was not driven by blind revenge the way she had originally assumed. The two of them sat together reviewing the early outline of a restructuring plan, and Mason noticed a medical and relief flight route buried in the schedule, one that had once been a personal point of pride for her mother. He decided, without needing to be convinced, that this particular route would remain protected within any final rescue plan. The section closed with Amelia receiving a formal summons to appear before the bankruptcy court, where Madison Air's remaining assets could potentially be placed up for auction entirely. That night, Amelia sat alone with her mother's letter spread open on the kitchen table, reading it over and over until the careful handwriting had practically memorized itself into her mind. She thought about all the years she had spent believing that strength meant refusing to apologize, refusing to admit fault, refusing to let anyone see a crack in her armor. Yet here was her own mother, a woman she had always considered untouchable and unshakable, writing with open gratitude to a family she had no obligation to acknowledge at all. It struck Amelia that perhaps real strength had never been about control, but about knowing precisely who deserved credit and having the humility to give it freely. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside its envelope, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to cry without anyone watching her do it. The bankruptcy hearing convened in a tense courtroom filled with investors circling the proceedings like scavengers, hoping to acquire Madison Air cheaply enough to strip its assets down to nothing. Amelia sat in the front row, no longer holding any real authority over the outcome, watching a process that would decide the fate of everything her mother had built decades earlier. Lucas attempted to negotiate quietly with a hedge fund representative, though the terms they offered were harsh enough to guarantee mass layoffs and the eventual dismantling of the entire fleet. Evelyn presented the court with the bank's position, explaining that Madison Air needed a new owner capable of settling its debts, restoring safety compliance, and preserving essential operations rather than simply liquidating for short-term profit. Joseph appeared as well, listed now as a subject of ongoing investigation, still attempting weakly to shift blame onto both Mason and Amelia, despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against him. Mason stepped forward with his documentation of purchased debt, technical evidence, and a fully formed operational plan for the airline's future. He proposed using his position as the primary secured creditor to acquire Madison Air's remaining assets entirely, according to the terms of a formal restructuring agreement already reviewed by the court. A murmur spread across the room the moment the scale of his proposal became clear to everyone present. Amelia looked at Mason, finally understanding that his earlier remark about buying her empire had never been a simple figure of speech at all. Mason committed publicly to retaining qualified staff, conducting a complete recertification of the entire fleet, establishing a maintenance center at his own hangar, and replacing the airline's compromised leadership from the ground up. The judge asked pointedly why he believed himself capable of running an airline at all. Mason answered by laying out his history in aviation technology, his patents, his old licensing agreements, and years of technical experience most people in the room had no idea he possessed. Jackson stood to offer testimony, confirming that Mason had quietly protected the airline's safety systems on more than one occasion over the years, often without any recognition or compensation for doing so. Amelia rose unexpectedly, not to fight for control, but to acknowledge openly that Mason was the only person in the room with a genuine plan capable of saving the company her mother had built from nothing. It was, for her, a moment of placing the survival of the airline above her own pride for what felt like the first time in years. The judge approved Mason's proposal, contingent on strict ongoing oversight to ensure every commitment was honored in full. Mason became the new owner of Madison Air that same afternoon, the papers finalized before the courtroom had even fully emptied out. Amelia lost her position as chief executive, though she was offered a role rebuilding the company's public reputation under the new ownership structure now firmly in place. The section closed with Mason signing the final transfer documents while Amelia stood quietly beside him, watching the pen move across paper that would forever change both of their lives, unable to look away from the moment everything had truly shifted for good. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered quickly, shouting questions about what the sudden change in ownership meant for passengers, employees, and the thousands of families who depended on Madison Air for their livelihoods. Mason declined to answer most of it, offering only a brief statement that his priority was restoring trust in the airline's safety and stability, nothing more theatrical than that. Evelyn walked beside him toward the parking lot, already discussing logistics for the transition period and the timeline the bank expected him to follow. Amelia trailed a few steps behind, feeling the strange weight of walking out of a building where she had entered as chief executive and left as something far less certain. She caught Mason's eye briefly before he climbed into his truck, and for once neither of them felt the need to say anything at all, the silence between them carrying more honesty than any words could have managed. In the months that followed the acquisition, Madison Air renamed its safety program the Carter Safety Division, a quiet tribute to the very technology that had once been buried and forgotten. Mason's hangar received significant upgrades, though he refused to remove the faded sign his father had hung decades earlier, insisting the old name remain visible above the new equipment installed beneath it. He did not erase the past. Instead, he transformed it into an independent technical center, serving the entire fleet. A place built on the same values his father had once tried to uphold with far fewer resources. Joseph faced a lengthy investigation into fraud, falsified maintenance records, and secret payments funneled through shell companies he had controlled for years. Lucas left the legal team shortly afterward, once it became clear he had helped conceal several contract terms that had worked directly against the airline's own interests. Amelia was no longer the powerful chief executive she had once been, yet she chose to remain with the company, accepting a far smaller role focused on rebuilding trust with employees and the public alike. She met personally with technicians and flight crews who had been affected by the crisis, offering apologies in person rather than through a prepared statement written by someone else. Many of them did not trust her at first, understandably skeptical after years of feeling unheard under her previous leadership. Amelia did not give up, showing up consistently, listening more than she spoke, and slowly proving through action rather than words that she intended to change. Mason kept a careful distance from her during this period, refusing to let the story slide into anything resembling a hurried romance before either of them had truly earned it. He gave her the opportunity to rebuild specifically because she had chosen, in that courtroom, to tell the truth rather than fight for power she no longer deserved to hold. A brief moment showed Mason receiving a short message from his daughter Grace, simply wishing him good luck, a detail included only to remind the audience of his life at home without pulling her into the center of the unfolding drama. Mason looked out across the runway one quiet evening, understanding fully that everything he had done was never only about defeating Amelia, but about building something stable and lasting for the people who depended on it. Amelia came to the hangar one final time, carrying the last letter her mother had ever written, and placed it gently into Mason's hands as though returning something long overdue. In the letter, Madison Langford had written that an airline only deserved to exist if it respected the hands that kept its planes safe in the air. Amelia admitted she had understood that truth far too late to spare anyone the pain her arrogance had caused. Mason told her that late was still better than never, a small mercy offered without excusing what had come before it. The first flight following the full restructuring departed without incident early one clear morning, lifting off smoothly against a pale sky streaked with the first light of dawn. Employees gathered along the edge of the runway to watch, their reaction quiet and restrained rather than loud or celebratory, a shared moment of relief more than triumph. Amelia stood among them, no longer carrying the arrogance that had once defined nearly everything she did. Mason was no longer the man who had once been pressured to sell his hangar for the price of scrap metal. He had become the man who preserved a legacy, protected innocent people caught in someone else's greed, and ultimately purchased the very empire that had once looked down on him without a second thought. The story closed on the wide-open doors of the hangar, a single aircraft taxiing slowly out beneath the soft golden light of early morning, ready for whatever came next. If Mason Carter's rise left you feeling satisfied, share your thoughts below. Never underestimate the person who quietly holds the real keys to everything. Stay tuned for more stories about people who were dismissed, overlooked, and pushed aside, yet ultimately left the whole world watching in stunned silence at what they truly accomplished against every possible expectation.